thank you for that personal, if not over-generous introduction. I want to thank all the people who made it possible for me to come back to Sao Paulo. Some of you know I once lived here for a short time. I lived in Brazil for a longer time, but it's nice to be back. It feels comfortable. It has changed, however. Brazil is one of these countries you must go back to at least every 2 or 3 years because it keeps changing out from under you. So does the language of Brazil, so I'll have to revive the Portuguese. I'm going to talk then about not so much North and South, but North and South and East and West, so to speak, and what I think has been happening to the discipline of political science. Mao Zedong anticipated the provocative theme of this conference. I will cite him and then paraphrase him for the purposes of an introduction to this talk. Mao began with an ancient Chinese saying. I think he very frequently did that. Either the east wind prevails over the west wind, or the west wind prevails over the east wind. Right? And then he went on to say, of course, that thanks to him and his revolution, from then on, the wind would blow from the eastern wind of socialism would blow, and then he mentioned specifically overwhelmingly prevail over the western wind of imperialism. I don't know quite how we would feel about the current eastern wind or the wind of eastern capitalism blowing over the western wind of, shall we say, liberal and social democracy, but we'll leave that aside. Anyway, I think that, in my opinion, we are moving and have already considerably moved in the direction of a system in which there is no prevailing wind, in which the winds are variable and even unpredictable. They certainly no longer come overwhelmingly from the same direction, the direction with which Luciano got his ideas for studying the European Parliament, namely from the United States. Today, innovations in theories, concepts, and methods can come from any direction. Moreover, they do not have to originate from large sovereign national states, but they can also come from small, subordinate provincial units, or even larger regional supranational organizations like the European Union. Now, I'm not claiming that political science is going to be blown around aimlessly in every direction by fads and fashions. There are still a few poles of concentrated wind power around which political scientists gather in greater numbers and to which graduate students prefer to go. The identity, however, and variety of these poles has proliferated over recent decades. The wind of northern western imperialism blowing from the United States is still strong, but it has become increasingly challenged, certainly not by the polar opposite of southern and eastern socialism, as Mao would have said it, but by eddies of varying strength and substance coming from an alternative to the northwest pole, namely an increasingly unified European political science and diverse centers of innovation in the South, namely Latin America, and particularly here in Brazil, and even in Africa, where I just returned, and where African or South African universities are becoming increasingly active and I think creative in political science. So having incorporated, let us say American political science, having incorporated these exotic places into its imperial domain after World War II under the guise of area studies, American political scientists now face the prospect of being increasingly marginalized by the very practitioners coming from its former academic colonies who are now calling into question many of their basic assumptions. For Americanists have long suffered a peculiar form of schizophrenia in political science. They have always insisted that the United States is exceptional, and therefore they don't need or do not think it desirable even to compare the United States with other countries. It's exceptional, therefore incomparable, so to speak. On the other hand, They are deeply convinced that anything they discover about the United States, and even any method they use to discover it, is universal. So on the one hand, they're exceptional and don't touch us, don't make us learn about some other country. And on the other hand, everything they find out, like legislative behavior, they will insist that the world. We can talk about that another time, okay. But that is, I think, been really at the root of some of the problems in the discipline of political science. Lots of people have taken this universalistic claim seriously and even done very creative, productive work. But I think we have to recognize the schizophrenia. Now, if I can read all these notes. So what seems to be important about political science at this moment is that it is being practiced, I couldn't think of a good English, the French expression is tout azimut, from all directions. I don't know exactly, from all points of the compass, so to speak. But that the assumptions, methods, concepts it employs are coming less and less from a single or the same source. We are still a long way from being a universal or global discipline in which the training of students, the employment of graduates, the sponsorship of research, and the authorship of books and articles no longer reflect national restrictions, cultural distortions, or hegemonic pretensions. Ideally, if we were a truly universal discipline, it would be the case that students, say, from country X would be just as likely to study in country Y as students in country Y would be to study political science in country X. That isn't the case. So we are still have a deep pattern of dependency upon certain kinds of sectors or countries, but that seems to me to be changing. And it's certainly true, very rapidly, within the context of Europe, thanks especially, of course, to programs such as Erasmus and various other initiatives of the European Union. Now it is becoming increasingly common, not merely for European students to study in each other's countries in almost identical or very similar proportions, but also to find employment and to move around and have joint projects, etc. So in the case of Europe, you almost have reached that point of parity. I once did a study in an article I published a little while ago in which I examined the major political science journals of the United States, Canada, Great Britain, and continental Europe, and I simply looked over, I think it was 25 or 30 years worth of articles, and I came up with a sort of index of parochialism. And you can guess, of course, that the winner of the index of parochialism was the American Political Science Review. So the chances of publishing a work edited by a foreigner or about foreign countries was very, very low. Whereas if you looked at the Italian or the French or the German, politische Vierteljahrschrift, or any of these Scandinavian ones especially, then you found much more of this kind of tout azimut. You even find in Europe these days articles in national political science journals in other than the national language. Try to imagine the American Political Science Review publishing an article in Spanish or French, not to mention Portuguese, right? So, anyway, but that gives you an idea of some of the differences that still persist.